Hello and welcome to the first out of a series of videos about photography, and today we'll be talking about exposure and focal length, two of the most important concepts in photography, certainly very basic ones, and we'll be talking a bit about camera properties and anatomy as well as how that fits with the rest of exposure and focal length. So let's get started. Well, the camera type that we will be focusing on is the DSLR, or the Digital Single Lens Reflex Camera. This is by far the most common type of a professional camera out there in the market right now, although arguably other camera types such as mirrorless cameras are catching up in popularity, but still we'll be focusing on the good old traditional DSLR. And inside the DSLR, there are 7 main components. The first, of course, is the camera body itself. Number 2 is the lens. Number 3 is the mirror inside the camera body that opens and closes based on the shutter, which similarly opens and closes to let light in and reach the sensor. Number 5, the sensor, which converts light energy to electrical energy, as well as number 6, the viewfinder, which comprises the pentaprism and pentamirror, as well as an objective lens to allow the photographer to see the scene in front of him, and last but definitely not least, the LCD screen, which is used for image playback, for video recording, etc. The sensor inside a DSLR camera is most often the CMOS type. And CMOS stands for complementary metal oxide semiconductor. Essentially, this type of sensor is a collection of PN semiconductor junctions which convert light energy to electrical energy in the form of a signal. So, the brighter the light, the higher the voltage that the PN semiconductor junction produces. And by extension, the brighter the light, the higher the voltage the sensor produces. So, because of this, certain signal processing functions need to be made by the sensor, and this is known as the gain. I'm sure if you have learned audio before, you would have known what gain is. Gain is input sensitivity, and similarly for cameras, we have sensor sensitivity, which is actually the ISO, which I'll talk about later. So, this is not an essential concept, but it's really good for your information. Well, the first and foremost concept in photography is exposure. We talk about exposure all the time, and its precise technical definition is the amount of light reaching the sensor, but more often than not, it is interchangeably used with brightness. It is used synonymously with brightness. So if I say your picture is overexposed, it means that it's over bright. It's too bright. And if your picture is underexposed, I'm saying that your picture is under bright or too dark. So keep that concept in your mind when we talk about exposure, because it is certainly a very important concept in photography. And we have a way of measuring exposure, and that is the stop. It is a base 2 logarithmic unit describing a doubling or a halving in exposure. So, if your photograph is overexposed by 1 stop, that means that your picture is twice as bright as what it should be. Similarly, if I say that your photograph is 2 stops underexposed, I am essentially saying that your picture is 4 times less bright than what it should be. Okay, so keep that concept of stop being a doubling or halving in the exposure level. Keep that in mind, because that is very important when we talk about elements of the exposure trinity, which we are coming to now. One element of the exposure trinity, or some people call it the exposure triangle, is the ISO. That's the first element out of the 3, and it is the sensitivity of the sensor to light that's coming in. And ISO values can range from 100, 200, 400, 800, all the way up to around 6400 or 6400. Sometimes in most cameras, it can go way up until maybe around 256,000 or even higher than that. But normally that level of ISO isn't really used for our applications, practical applications. So in daily life, in everyday photography, normally the ISO settings we use range from 100 to 3200. The main function of the ISO is to the sensitivity of the sensor. So a higher ISO value, which will mean that the sensor is more sensitive to light, and hence the picture that you get will be a brighter one. Similarly, a lower ISO value will mean that your sensor is less sensitive to light. So because of that, whatever light comes in, your sensor doesn't really bother to boost it up much. So what you'll get is a darker picture as a result. However, with each of the elements in the exposure triangle, they have their own individual side effects. And for ISO, a higher ISO value will mean more image noise. This is most often the case with dark situations, with situations of low light. This has something to do with the signal to noise ratio, which is, again, for your information. I'm trying to have a very interdisciplinary approach when I teach media, because I think that concepts in videography, photography, and audio, and even stage lighting can be synthesized, and a lot of knowledge is actually common. A lot of concepts are common, and the only differences between each of them in their various fields is just the nomenclature or terminology. But well, I digress. So that's what ISO is: how sensitive your image sensor is to light. And this is an example of color noise, random specks of pixels of colored pixels. And this is luminance or black and white noise. Why is it called luminance? Because it's about brightness. So it's about whether it's bright or dark, whether it's white or black. So it's white or black, so it's black and white noise. So it will look like somewhat like salt and pepper maybe. It looks like television static when you can't get the precise frequency of the television channel. So these two types of noise, color and luminance, can be corrected for in Lightroom or in Photoshop, but that's for another day, that's another video. So these are the two types of noise. And the second element of the exposure trinity is aperture, which is the size of the lens opening, the size of the hole in your lens. Why is this important? Well, this is because if you have a bigger hole, more light can go in and reach your sensor. If you have a smaller hole, less light can go through the lens to your sensor. So we'll talk about that later. But first of all, aperture is expressed as an F number. So we let F be the focal length, D be the diameter of the aperture diaphragm, and K be the ratio of the focal length to the aperture diameter. And K is precisely the F number that we're talking about. If you can see here, K equals F over D, and that implies that D equals F over K, which means that D is inversely proportional to K for some F. Yes, aperture diameter, focal length, and the ratio, they are all variables and they all change. So in order to establish a relationship between D and K, such that if D increases, K decreases, your F must be constant. So that is eventually what we get for some F, for some focal length. As K increases, D decreases. And if we assume that the aperture is perfectly circular, the aperture area would simply be pi r squared, which will be pi times d over 2 squared, which is pi d squared over 4. So for the amount of light entering the lens to be doubled, the aperture area must be doubled, which consequentially means that the aperture diameter must be increased or multiplied by a factor of square root of 2. Similarly, for the amount of light entering the lens to be halved, the aperture area must be halved as well. So your aperture diameter must be decreased by a factor of the square root of 2. And what does this, and this results in a really, to be honest, a very spectacular result in a convergence of mathematics and photography, which I really, really appreciate, which is the square root of 2 f number scale. So these values here are in 1/3 stops. So 1/3 multiples of third powers of the square root of 2, and they are to two significant figures, so you can see familiar numbers, familiar aperture values, familiar f numbers in this table. So you can see f1.4, f1.8, f2.0, f3.2, f2.8, f3.5, 9, 8, 11, 13, very, very common aperture values. These are all powers of the square root of 2. That's an important thing to keep in mind, because now we know if you want to have a one-stop increase in exposure, which means doubling the exposure, which means doubling the area of the aperture diaphragm, which means increasing your aperture diameter by a factor of a square root of 2. So everything is linked, which is really, really beautiful. So the main function of aperture is essentially the hole in the lens, right? So we know that D is inversely proportional to K, which means that the bigger the aperture, or the longer the aperture diameter, the smaller K is, and K is your f number. So we get this very nice result, which is that a smaller f number implies a bigger aperture, and hence a brighter image, because the bigger the hole in your lens, more light is going in and hitting the sensor. Whereas a bigger f number implies a smaller aperture, which implies a darker image, because less light is passing through your lens to reach the sensor, because the hole in your lens is smaller. Okay, and as with any element of the exposure trinity, you have a side effect, and the side effect of aperture is depth of field. A smaller f number, which means a bigger aperture, it will result in a shallower depth of field, and a bigger f number, which means a smaller aperture, will imply a deeper depth of field. So what is the depth of field? Well, as you can see right here, the depth of field is the range of things in the foreground, midground, background that are in focus. So in that depth, so away from you and nearer to and closer to you. On that axis, right? If you have a shallow depth of field, such as the picture on the left, which is f2, which is a really, really large aperture size, you can see that only the toy monkey is in focus, whereas the rest of everything behind all of the background is blurry and out of focus. That is a shallow depth of field. Whereas if you have a deep depth of field, such as in the picture on the right, which is taken with an aperture of f22, which means that the aperture size is very small, because 22 is bigger than 2, which means that aperture of f22, the aperture size is smaller than that of f2, inversely proportional. Remember that again, okay? And that is what we call a deep depth of field. So generally, when do you want a shallow depth of field with very nice blurry background? When you're taking portraits of people. You don't want the background to interfere with their faces. You want the model or the subject's face to be perfectly clear, whereas while everything in the background is nice and blur. And if you want to take a landscape photograph of maybe some mountains or a nice forest, you want every single tree to be clear and in focus. You don't want the tree in front of you to be in focus, whereas all the other trees behind that tree are all blur. You don't want that. You want a whole nice landscape where everything is in focus. In that case, you want a deep depth of field, which means using a smaller aperture, and a smaller aperture implies a larger f number. Okay, remember that. So that's what depth of field is for, and that's how the side effects of aperture can be used in different applications. And a really fancy word that people use to describe these lights, these blurred out circles of light, is bokeh. And bokeh is achieved using a big aperture and a small f-stop value. Okay, again, always remember this inverse relationship. The bigger the hole, the smaller the number. The bigger the number, the smaller the hole. Make sense? Okay, I hope it does. So what you see here is bokeh. This is very popular with Instagrammers. They like and with portrait photographers. People like portraits of nightlife and on the streets with a nice model clearly in focus, whereas while all the lights, all the street lights in the background are beautifully blurred. So that's called bokeh. It's quite a nice effect if you ask me. And that brings us to the third of the three elements in the exposure trinity, which is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is very simply the duration of exposure. I know the name says speed, so it should be something like meters per second, right? But it's actually an amount of time. It can be quite confusing, but just think of it as how quick the shutter opens and closes. Okay? The shutter speed is, well, the duration of exposure, which means how long the shutter is open to let the light in, entering the camera and reaching the sensor. So, a slower shutter speed will mean a longer duration of time where the shutter is left open for the light to come in. A faster shutter speed means that the shutter opens and closes really quick, and that means that the time that the shutter is open, the duration of time where the shutter is open is not that much. It's a really small amount of time, so the amount of light that comes and reaches the sensor is also less. So that's what you get by a faster shutter speed and a slower shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in seconds because it's the duration of time, okay? And with a bigger denominator, you get a smaller value. So 1/100 seconds is a slower shutter speed or a longer duration of exposure compared to 1/800 seconds, which is a faster shutter speed and a shorter amount of time for which the shutter is open and the light is left to expose the sensor. So a faster shutter speed is, well, usually meant to freeze motion, such as in this picture of these baseball players on the top right. And a slower shutter speed is intended to blur motion, such as these fabulous light trails in a city. I believe it's Hong Kong on the bottom right. However, this is a side effect, actually not so much of a side effect, but rather a drawback of the shutter speed, which is that a slower shutter speed will leave you more vulnerable to shake or motion blur, which means that if you have shaky hands, if you have a slower shutter speed, which tends to blur motion and have like streaks of light, like at the bottom right picture, right? So if your hands are very shaky when you hold the camera, what happens is that the picture that you will take will be blur, because as you're shaking the camera will not capture that one scene that quickly, in a snap. The camera won't do that. The camera will spend a long time to expose the sensor to the light, and because of that, it is slow, and thus there will be you'll get motion blur or blur induced by motion. You'll get a blurry photograph. Okay, basically. If you use a faster shutter speed, you will avoid that issue, because when even if you're shaking your hands, the camera will just capture that snapshot, that snapshot in time where everything is just frozen. So remember that is the main function and side effect of the shutter speed. Last but not least, this is not about exposure. This isn't about camera. Okay, this kind of part of camera properties, but rather properties of the lens. This is really, really important, which the focal length, which is colloquially known as a zoom. That's what people normally call it as, okay, the zoom. So if it's more zoomed in or zoomed out, people are actually referring to the focal length of the lens. And focal length is measured in millimeters. The longer the focal length, the more zoomed in your picture is. The shorter your focal length, the more zoomed out your picture is. So, for example, if you are using a 135mm lens and you tell your friend, hey, I have to zoom out, the crop is too tight, I must zoom out to capture the whole scene. Well, then your friend will tell you to perhaps use a 24mm lens, some lens of a shorter focal length, because that's more zoomed out. However, a side effect of focal length is compression and pincushion distortion, or extension and barrel distortion, depending on whether you use a longer or a shorter focal length. I'll explain this in a while, but essentially it is something to do with how elements in the scene are distributed or are spaced apart or spread out. Anyway, you'll see. Okay, so these are the effects of different focal lengths. The picture on your left is taken using a telephoto lens of around 200mm, and the photo on your right is taken with an ultra wide angle lens of around 12mm. Notice that 200mm is longer than 12mm, and so 200mm is more zoomed in than 12mm. Okay, always think about that, okay? And the photo on the left suffers from compression distortion, which is what we refer to when we're talking about distance being squashed. So what's 1 meter in front of you and what's 100 meters in front of you, if it's squeezed, if these two things are squeezed, then that's compression distortion. So it compresses distance. So if you can see on the left, this block of flats, the top floor and the bottom floor, they are sort of squeezed and smashed together into this planar image. Well, that's compression distortion. Contrast that with the picture on the right, which is taken with an ultra wide angle lens, and it suffers from extension distortion. So distances are exaggerated. What's near to you will seem nearer, and what's far away from you will seem further. So distances are exaggerated. What's 1 meter in front of you will look like it's 0.1 meters in front of you. What's 100 meters in front of you will look like it's 200 meters in front of you. Something like that. Okay, so it exaggerates distance. It stretches things apart. You can think about it as, stretching distances apart, whereas in the telephoto image on the left, it's about squeezing things together, squashing things together. So that's extension and compression distortion. And definitely, last but not least, is the difference between barrel and pincushion distortion. On the picture on the left has pincushion distortion, which is typically found in most telephoto lenses, and this essentially means that your image is concave, so it sort of bulges inwards. Okay, if you think about it, it kind of like it is, there's a depression into your screen, so your screen is sucking the photograph a bit. Well, I don't think it's that obvious in the picture on the left, but in the picture on the right, it is quite obvious. It has barrel distortion, which means that the image looks bulging out at you. So it sort of looks spherical, like a ball in a way. It's convex. It's bulging out. Okay, I think that you can see a little bit of that effect, being round, bulging out a bit, comparing to that with the image on the left, which is sort of like sucked in or pulled in by the screen. So it's kind of depressed into the screen. So that's the difference between pincushion and barrel distortion. Barrel distortion looks as if it's bulging out. Pincushion distortion looks like the picture is being sucked itself in, like some sort of black hole or something. Okay, and that marks the end of our very first video, which is about exposure, focal length, and a bit of camera anatomy. Hopefully this provides a good introduction to the basic fundamentals of photography, and keep on exploring, keep on playing with the different settings of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and seeing what different effects you can get out of them. And always remember, getting the correct brightness means having a good balance, or getting a correct exposure means having a good balance of ISO, shutter speed, and exposure. But always bear in mind that these individual elements of the exposure trinity have their own individual side effects. So when you're balancing which one to increase and decrease to overall, on average, have the correct exposure, think about the side effects that each of these elements in the exposure trinity will bring to your photograph. So some food for thought. Think about that when you are exploring and shooting. Happy shooting, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.